All right, all right. Welcome everybody to another episode of Seat Automotive Podcast. Guys, today we've got something really cool and exciting because if you're an automotive enthusiast, you know all about Porsche, or at least you think you do. By the way, we're going to talk about Porsche. We got to square that away. And I've got the right two guys. I've got Harvey. I've known Harvey for a number of years, incredible Porsche background. Porsche Parade 2008 chairperson, leader of PCA for the Carolinas in the past, and just overall great guy. Welcome, Harvey.
Thank you so much, CJ.
All right, all right. And then we've got Trent. And again, if you're in the Charlotte area car community, you know Trent. And he is most certainly a Euro sports car and performance car motorsports enthusiast, but he's also the guy that runs Cars and Cappuccino in the Charlotte area. And if you want to be a part of the exotic and Euro car community in the Charlotte area, you got to know Trent and you got to go to Cars and Cappuccino. What's up, Trent?
Thanks, CJ.
All right, fellas, let's get into this. First things first, we'll start with you, Harvey. When I think about our hobby and I think about performance cars and sports cars, the Porsche brand is pervasive and the 911 is at least top five. And it's been that way for decades. It's all subjective, I suppose, but why has Porsche been so wildly successful with the 911 platform forever? Go ahead.
That's a great question. I think a lot of it stems from our childhood. I remember the first time that I ever saw a 911, it was like, what is that? I mean, it just resonated. I was probably 8, 9 years old, something like that. And every time that I saw one, it was special. When I was commuting from my parents' home to Chapel Hill, I would drive through Goldsboro, and Goldsboro being a military town, the young guys usually have some interesting stuff. And there was always this 911 that was parked at this garage, and it just became embedded in my brain over time. And as I got older and was able to put a little bit of money together, that's really where it started for me. My first one was I bought my first one was in 1995. It was a piece of crap 73 911T. I had to replace the pans in first thing, but I loved it. It was a fantastic learning experience. But it's just, the shape's iconic. You go through all the different generations. It's what it is every time that you see this vehicle. And there's so many different iterations, but you know what it is. I think that's a big part of it. The engineering is fantastic. There's a reason that, and Trent, you can jump in here. I can't remember the exact stat, but it's like 75-80% of every Porsche ever built is still on the road.
Yeah.
That resonates.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think CJ, part of the reason the 911 is still, I would probably use the word iconic to describe it, right, is I think the consistency over the years, right? Like it is, as Harvey was saying, like, it has the same basic layout, right? It was a rear engine kind of curvy machine that looks a little bit different than anything else on the road, right? But I would say too, like, in reality, it's ebbed and flowed in its popularity, right? Like we're living in a time right now where it's very popular. But if you turn back the clock to like the 70s, there was a time when the 911 was on the chopping block for Porsche. Like they're like, hey, it's had its run, it's been good to us, but we're going to be done with this thing called the 911, right? So it's popular, and I think our perception about it is a little bit skewed right now because we're like in a really, it's viewed as a very iconic and popular car, and it is iconic, but it's not always been that way. It really truly has ebbed and flowed over time.
Trent, you said something very interesting there. Let's drill on that because, was the 70s the malaise era for the 911?
I wouldn't say the entirety of the 70s, but there are definitely what 911 and air-cooled folks, and that's kind of where my interests lie with the 911 up until about 1996 or so. The mid-year cars, which is really like 75, 76, 77, they're generally regarded as, probably the worst of the 911s. Not because of Porsche engineering or anything like that failed the car, or they did something radically different that made it worse. They were Porsche at that time, the regulations around emissions were changing rapidly. The technology wasn't as refined as it is now. So Porsche had to make some decisions around how that car was going to perform in order to make it pass emissions in the United States and California in particular, right? So they kind of detuned them. They put some stuff on them that made them burn more cleanly, but really kind of, I think from a car guy's perspective, seemed a little bit backwards looking, but it just was what it was. So in a way, yeah. But then there's also some super iconic stuff that came out of Porsche in the 70s as well. So that's why I say not the entire decade, but I would say there was a time in the middle where it was probably the worst 911, those 75, 76, 77. And I'm speaking as a guy who's owned a 77 911, right? So I feel comfortable making that statement. Harvey, I mean, you see it the same way?
Yeah, well, building upon what you just talked about, Porsche had plans to do away with the 911 because of the emissions issues. The engines were getting weaker and weaker and weaker. They had thermal reactors before the catalytic converters, and in mid 70s, like you called out, the 75, 76, 77, they were trash engines, and all of them been fixed or replaced by now. But in the early 70s, Porsche was working on the 928, and it was intended to replace the 911. And basically, it was a German Camaro, front engine V8, 2+2 seating, rear transaxle. Actually, it's kind of more like the current Corvette. But that was intended to do away with the 911, and that was the game plan. What changed was Porsche hired an American named Peter Schutz to be CEO. He'd worked at Caterpillar for a number of years, had no background in Porsche, and he basically saved the 911. And he said, what's this company all about? It was all about the 911, and he's like, all right, we're pivoting here. And while the 928 lasted through 1995, they never really iterated that too much, and they weren't going to build upon it. But the 911, from that point on, became the halo of the organization and continues to be today.
Yeah, so for the folks that are listening or watching, the 928's if you're of a certain age group, that's the risky business car, if that gives you a reference point. That's the 928 if you're a child of the 80s, like a couple
of Scarface.
Well, guys, let me ask you this, and yes, I do remember that, and I think that's super important. It seemed like every dentist in the 1980s had a 928. Sorry, a little humor here, but some people will remember that era. But in all seriousness, let's think about that. Like in the 70s and the 80s, and even going back to the 60s, what was the target for the 911? Was it a rich guy car? Was it an enthusiast car, serving, the middle to middle upper middle class, dare I say? Or was it the competitor with the Corvette? Where did this thing start?
Well, I mean, so if you look at the 911, remember that's the iteration from the predecessor car, which the 356, right? A 4-cylinder car. Again, absolutely rear engine car, similar kind of curves and shapes that was at that point beginning to be heavily associated with Porsche, right? The 911, when it was arriving on U.S. shores, I don't know that you could say that it was a rich person's car. I think it fell more in kind of the enthusiast category, right? It certainly wasn't holding itself out as a supercar or something like that. Though I don't know if that term had actually even been coined at that point in time. But I think it was more of an enthusiast car, folks that were looking for something a little bit different than what America had been producing by that time for decades, right? Which was big, huge hunks of metal, which, to be completely honest, that's kind of what I grew up on as a kid. I found my way to Porsche only kind of later in life. And I was honestly kind of dismissive of them when I was younger. I grew up in a house where my father was a GM and a Mopar fan, right? And so in my high school years, my dad and I did a lot of projects around those types of cars. And I didn't really have time for Porsches, or most European cars, but we can talk about that more later. But so to answer your question more succinctly, yeah, I think it was an enthusiast car, right? Because you had started to see Porsche start to pop up in the States post World War II. And you saw certain, in some cases, really iconic people gravitating to some of the Porsche, true competition focused cars like, James Dean, the 550 Spider, things like that. So, the image, the reputation of being a enthusiast car is kind of what Porsche, I think, was trying to capitalize on with the 911.
And I would agree with you, Trent. Back in the 50s, when Porsche first started bringing out the 356, they were a little pricey, and they got feedback on that, and then they came out with the iconic Speedster, which was basically a decontented cabriolet, lower windshield, no roll-up windows, very small, rickety, soft top. But that's where the mystique really began, is with that vehicle. And then you had the 550 Spider, which was, for the day, it was basically the Carrera GT of the 50s. I mean, it was super exotic, all aluminum, small, but it would beat cars that had double the horsepower, triple the horsepower, because it was so light. The power to weight, as we know, track stuff, power to weight's everything.
Guys, let's go way back for a moment. Listen, I'm enjoying the heck out of this conversation. Again, just when I thought I knew anything about Porsches, I've learned so much, and I'm taking some copious notes here because I'm really digging.
There'll be a quiz at the end, CJ.
Story of my life. Don't worry. D is for diploma. I'll just squeak by. But where did all this start? Talk about the intersection, or maybe the genesis. I mean, Volkswagen, the Beetle. What's the connectivity? There around kind of the birth of Porsche. What's the relationship there? Go ahead, fellas.
So the genesis is Professor Porsche. Ferdinand Porsche, not Ferry, designed the Volkswagen Beetle for Hitler and the Nazi Party. And there were several different iterations. Basically, it was rear engine, 4-seat, 2+2, if you will. And then at the end of World War II, everything was dead. Ferdinand Porsche was arrested by the French. He went to a French prison. His sons basically continued running the company, and they were like, all right, what can we do to make this a new vehicle? And Ferry started designing a car, but knowing that there wasn't a whole lot of engineering and manufacturing availability, they leveraged stock Volkswagen parts to make this happen. So the original one, the number one, was actually a cabriolet roadster with a mid-engine. So that was the genesis of the 356. But then when they decided to quote unquote productionize it, it ended up going back to a rear engine to make it simpler for production, blah, and there we have it. And then along the course of evolving over the years, slowly Volkswagen parts were replaced by true Porsche parts. So that's kind of the beginning, and over the years it got more and more different. And then in the early 60s, when late 50s, early 60s, when they started designing the 911, the 911 was truly the first clean sheet bespoke Porsche made.
And Harv, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Porsche family actually has a lot of its roots not only in Germany but Austria as well, right? Like a lot of the stuff that we kind of just automatically, and it's logical, right? Porsche is based in Stuttgart, but a lot of this stuff actually came out of the Porsche family property that's actually in Austria. So it's kind of an interesting little side note. Definitely, like if you've been to either of those countries, it's kind of tough to discern them because like they're very similar. Like I think of Austria as kind of like the resort side of Germany, right? It's really beautiful, a lot of mountains and stuff. But the Porsche family actually built some of the first cars on their property in Austria.
Yeah, it was actually, I believe it was originally a sawmill. And they had basically been bombed out of Stuttgart. And so they went back to their family roots, and that's where they built I think it's the first 48 cars that they were built in that sawmill. And then they moved production to Stuttgart in I want to say 49 or 50.
And CJ, if you think about like German cars post World War II, all those micro cars that you might be familiar with, like the Isetta, like Messerschmitt, which was literally making fighter planes for the Luftwaffe, like was completely obviously out of business after losing World War II. So they resorted to building like little tiny cars, as did BMW, that were all like short manufacturing capabilities and spawned all these little tiny micro cars. They're all post World War II German cars largely because of what transpired. Porsche never really got in the micro car game that I recall hard, right? Like they never really did that. They were still kind of sticking to their guns, working on the 356. And as he said, as Harvey said, dipping into the Volkswagen parts bin and slapping them in the Porsches,
Right.
Yeah, Porsche did a lot of other projects. They were an engineering firm. They originally were not a manufacturing entity, and they eventually became a manufacturing entity. But they did a lot of projects for the Nazis during that era. But they also designed a lot of different race cars. They did all sorts of engineering stuff. Interesting side note. I was actually talking to a friend of mine about this the other day. Harley Davidson, probably a decade ago, came out with a new motorcycle called the V-Rod.
Yep.
And it was the first water-cooled engine that Harley Davidson ever done. Porsche actually designed that engine. So they still, no kidding, they still do engineering stuff like that.
Well, and Harvey, to that point, and I know you know this, but you know me, I'm big on automotive trivia at my events because it's a wacky, fun thing. But I'm an aviation guy by way of background as well, early on in my career. And the Porsche aircraft engine, hello, not many people know about it. Mm-hmm. I believe it was a failed experiment economically.
Yes.
But those that know, they're kind of collector's items. I think they're all, none of them are flying anymore. But there's probably some enthusiasts who have them, in their man caves. Go ahead.
Yeah, the aircraft in I can't remember, is either I think it's the Mooney. Yeah.
Mooney, yeah, I think it's a Mooney. Yeah.
So they basically took I think it was in the mid 80s. I want to say the mid 80s. They took a 911 engine and they put, because the speed of you would know this, CJ, because you have to put gearing to slow the prop down in order for it to be usable, and so they used it was basically a 911 engine with a bunch of tweaks on it, and from a performance perspective, it was spectacular, but from a commercial angle, it just did not resonate. So, and I think they built them for like 3-4 years, something like that.
Mm.
It may have been longer, but that's what I recall.
Yep. Hey, Trent, let's talk some controversy here, because why not?
Sure.
And listen, you guys brought it up, so I'm gonna drill on it. Air cooled versus water cooled.
Yeah.
I don't think people realize what blasphemy that was. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So as I kind of alluded to, I'm more of an air cooled guy. So my personal experiences with 911s in particular, I've always been air cooled. Now I've driven a lot of water cooled cars, and just so the folks that know, like the big change and to the 911 happened hard. It was what the second half of 96, beginning of 97 when the 996 came out.
Yeah, it was 90. Yeah, 90. No, it's 98. 98 when the 996, because Europeans got them before, so there are some 98s. We didn't get them until 99.
Yeah, and so for those who are listening and watching along, so what that really meant is Porsche radically changed their approach to engines for the 911, right? Everything had been air cooled. So literally, when you look at a what a lot of us kind of associate as being the classic Porsche style, which, technically speaking, is more than likely what we would call a G-bodied car. They are air-cooled cars. There's no radiator, right? But what they do have is a ton of motor oil. So those little flat six motors are running like 11 plus quarts of oil, and they literally run down the length of the car to the front of the car, and then gets returned back to the engine, right? So if you really dig into it and you really get in the conversation, some folks will say, well, they're not air cooled, they're oil cooled, right? So like you can get into these little nuanced discussions. But for me, the air cooled 911 is just kind of, that's kind of what I started to get exposed to when I really started to dive into the Porsche and the cars. And there's a noise, a sound, and it's very visceral, right? And it's something very iconic about the noise that a flat six air cooled Porsche motor makes. And it's just resonated with me. And like, that's what I dig. That's what I'm into. That's been representative of my ownership of Porsches and 911s, has been the air cooled, because of the sounds that particular motor make. And the other thing is, the things are, comparatively speaking, pretty simple to work on and really reliable for the performance that you get from these motors, right? Like, these motors have been built up by true engineering firms to create massive amounts of horsepower out of a flat six engine, right? And they're in the world of classic sports cars, really pretty bulletproof, right? And that's, for me, as somebody that enjoys cars and have my whole life, like, that ticks a lot of boxes for me. Like, a very kind of iconic noise they make, the reliability, the power that they can create, the shape of the car, those are all boxes that get checked for me. But to bring it back, that change from air cooled to water cooled was a very strong line, and there are still people amongst us, Porsche people amongst us, that probably have never driven an a water cooled 911, because they're that hardcore about it. I don't have that type of perspective on it. I'm not anti GT3 RS, so if anybody's got a 2024 GT3 RS they want me to drive, I will willingly drive it. But that's kind of what it is, and momentous. Like, I don't know, Harvey, if you know any people that like straight up won't drive in a water cooled 911, but they were out there for some time.
Yeah, it's changed over the years, but we go as enthusiasts, and especially in the Porsche world, we go through these iterations, every few years. Because I remember when Porsche announced the Cayenne, people lost their minds, and they're like, "Oh my God!" Blah, and I'm a gearhead first and Porsche guy second, and I'm super enthusiastic about a lot of different stuff. But my view of it is that if Porsche needs to sell SUVs in order for me to continue to buy sports cars, so be it. I mean, I'm not going to get upset by that. But to your point, there are people. I've seen these T-shirts before. Porsche stopped building Porsches in 1965 when the 356 stopped production.
Yeah.
You still have pockets of that, and you get these levels of prejudice against people owning specific models. I remember 914. The 914 for a long time was a redheaded stepchild of the Porsche world. It's super accepted today. It's like the precursor to the Boxster and the Cayman platforms. So it all ties together, and I understand the people that have more enthusiasm for one model over another. Personally, I've owned 5 air cooleds. I was just running some numbers here, and I've owned 5 water cooled sports cars and various iterations of stuff in between. And I will tell you that the air cooleds have more character. They have more personality because they're old school. One of the things that I was going to mention, the chassis, the original 911 chassis, which from 1963 through 1998, when the last 993 rolled out, is basically the same platform. Your engine cradle, the suspension, interior stuff, blah. but the underlying structure was exactly the same. Porsche got their amortization out of that platform. It was nuts. And one of the things I love doing is someone that may have recently bought a 993. I'll tell them, sit in your car, and I said, run your finger underneath the gauge package, and they'll find several holes. And they're like, oh my God, why are those holes there? Well, that's where the sunroof switch was. That's where other switches were back in the day. Porsche never filled them in. Why should they? Anyway, but it's fascinating that platform was able to last that many decades.
Right.
And visually, you'll look at them, you'll see the similarities, but a lot of people think it's a completely different platform, and it's not. It's exactly the same.
Yeah, to Harvey's point, like I can pull a door off a 77 911, it'll fit on an 87 911. I can bolt it right up. It'll fit. It'll work. It's that uniform, right? And Harvey mentioned something, and I'm thinking of the folks that might be following along and aren't quite as familiar with the nomenclature, but like it gets a little confusing because we use the term 911, then we'll drop in like 993, or we'll drop in 964, and people like time out. I thought we're talking about the 911. Well, guess what? We still are, right? But these are just iterations of the 911. So we had the 911 G body that I mentioned earlier, and then that was superseded by the 964, which for maybe some of our younger listeners, that's the frame that the singer's Porsche cars, are based off of that 964. And then those were followed up with the 993 that Harvey was mentioning, which was the last iteration of the air-cooled 911, right? But CJ, going back to your like air-cooled, water-cooled discussion, when the 996, which again is a 911, came out, it came out with a water-cooled engine, but they also changed the designers changed some of the iconic visual cues of the 911 at that point in time, which I also think kind of waned some enthusiasm for adoption, because the iconic kind of like round-eyed headlights that are very similar to a Volkswagen, or if you know, even kind of like a Jeep, those all went away with the 996 model. And to this day, it's kind of disdained by a lot of people, the way the headlight shape changed. Yeah.
Broken egg headlights or whatever.
Yes. Yeah. That's what the term that a lot of people like to use. And like, it is polarizing, right? And for me personally, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I was kind of deep into like, man, that's a big mistake. My position softened on them a little bit. But like that was a big deal to people that were lifelong, 911 fanatics, to go from air to water. That was like, holy smokes. And then you change the headlights so radically. It was just like, 1-2 punch. And like a lot of people just, went on pause on the 911 for a while there, which really hard, for your point earlier, is part of the reason Porsche needed the Cayenne, right?
I'm gonna go back to the 964. I'm gonna draw some parallels between the 996 and the 964. So the 964, when it came out, it was 90% a new vehicle. Looked like the previous G body with rounded bumpers, but other than that, looked a lot like it. That vehicle, for a number of years, was the red-headed stepchild of the Porsche 911 world. People didn't want it. You could buy them super cheap. There were some weird issues with the way that Porsche built the engine without head gaskets for, I think it was the first year and a half, something like that. And they were almost throwaway cars for a long time. And then all of a sudden people were like, oh, this car is like 90% of a 993. And they're like, oh my God, look at the engineering in this thing. So now, because of that engineering, that's why they are considered to be bespoke vehicles, and they are being used for singers, backdating cars, and all sorts of stuff. So it's interesting to see the curve from being popular, very unpopular, and then back to being popular again. Same thing with the 996, your call. I always like the look, especially of the Gen 1 996. I think it was a little bit slab-sided, very much like the original 911. But I like the look. I like the fried egg, headlight look. And then the 9.
You're the guy. You're the one guy.
I'm the one guy. I like it. I like it. But I like the interior. I like everything about it. I never had a 996. I had two Boxsters of that generation, but I never had a 996.
Hmm.
But I would have purchased one if I could afford that one at that time. But now, but I don't like the 996.2, which is second generation. I hate the headlamps on it. I think the nose and tail are just ugly. But they are, but from an engineering perspective, it was a step up. But now the early 996s are starting to back up again. I mean, for a number of years, you could buy a 996 for mid-teens, and now they're mid-20s, low 30s. So the curve has it's popular now. It's picking up in popularity.
Yeah, the 996 turbos or 8-9 years ago, Harvey knows, like they were like such a steal in terms of performance per dollar. It was crazy. You know what I mean? It's kind of like the new vet. I feel that way about the new vet, like the new mid-engine vet in terms of dollars for performance.
Oh yeah.
It's probably the top of the charts right now. There was a time maybe a decade ago where the 996 turbos would have held that mark because you could pick these cars up in the mid 40s and you were just getting crazy performance out of them. And to Harvey's point, now they started to creep back up. So, and I looked at them. I came really close to buying a 996 turbo at one point in time.
This is fantastic. And another, maybe it's a controversial topic. Let's throw this out there. Just listening to you guys talk, and you kind of touched on it both. You talk to enough Porsche people, across the spectrum of let's say age, generational gaps, etc. But you hear a lot of discussion about whether or not the Cayman Boxster is actually the better sports car, and the Cayman Boxster platform is now what the 911 used to be, and the 911 has become more of a GT car. I hear this a lot. Where do you guys weigh in on that?
Trent, go ahead.
Yeah, from my perspective, I've always kind of felt about the Cayman like it's a mid-engine car, right? That if you went and spent a little bit of time at the track around Porsche track day type events, you would see a lot of guys hustling around that racetrack in Caymans and being really competitive and really, really, really well-driven, well-handling vehicles. So I think the Cayman, I think that argument holds true for the Cayman to some degree because it's always been a little more performance oriented, I think, of the two cars. Not to say a Boxster can't be performance oriented, but I think out of the box, the Cayman has been. And then we have this current iteration of the Cayman that's really largely got the 911 engine in it, and it's making the GT3s of the world really watch their rearview mirror and or straight up like, if you have the right driver, like a driver in a Cayman's going to beat even a driver in a 911 GT3 now, right? They've got the latest GT4 RS Cayman, right? So for me, like I really don't have an opinion on the Boxster because it's never really checked a box for me. But the Cayman, I've come close to thinking about purchasing a couple times because of what I think of it to be more of an enthusiast of those two cars, right? And I think it's being borne out by the way Porsche is continuing to invest in that platform and some of these iterations we're seeing in modern times that will just make them absolutely track tools. Now, your comment about is a 911 a more GT car than it once was? I mean, I think you could make that claim based on the overall dimension. If you look at an early 911 compared to the latest iteration, there's market differences in the overall dimensions of those two platforms. But dang, like to call the GT3 RS a GT car, like, I mean, that's a race car on the streets, in my opinion. Like that thing, like you roll that thing off that showroom floor and you know how to drive, you're probably podiuming your first race. I mean, they're that potent and powerful and well constructed and engineered. So I understand why people would say it. And I do think you could probably option out a 911 to make it be a GT car. But I feel like, it still has its kind of, really track focused DNA there, even regardless of whatever iteration you choose to go with in the modern cars. I mean,
my opinion is going to be slightly different than Trent. So CJ, I would agree that the 911, the Carrera S, less so the GTS, those are now more GT cars. The Cayman platform, the Boxster platform is going to handle better out of the box. It's just physics. It's just the way it works. I personally have a Cayman track car, first gen 987.1, and I have a 997.1. And I will tell you, the Cayman will outhandle the 911. Now, here's where it gets interesting though. If you've got someone that has a lot of track time, they can make the 911 platform drive better than the Cayman. But out of the box, if I could take Joe, I'm a track instructor too, so I'm coming from a different place here. So I can take two students, brand new, drop one in the Cayman, drop one in the 911. The guy in the Cayman is going to be quicker, faster than the guy in the 911 because the 911 has some quirky handling characteristics. But both platforms are awesome. But today, when you want a more edgy 911, you're going to have to check that Carrera T box. You're going to have to check that GT3 box. You're going to have to check the GTS box to get it to where an enthusiast would want the vehicle to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's important too. Like Harvey and I are both speaking kind of from an enthusiast perspective, right? Like that's, and I don't know. I mean, this is probably an interesting debate. Like, are we the target market anymore, Harvey? Or are we like?
No, we're not. We're markets like this. We're the enthusiast piece up here because I will put up with firmer suspension. You know, like on my 997, I have a Bilstein PSS 10 kit on it. My wife hates driving because it's too stiff, and I've actually got it set pretty soft. But that's what I want. When I want handling when I'm on the street, I want handling when I'm in the mountains, I want handling wherever I go to. That's just the way I'm wired. I'll put up with a little bit of harshness on the street. But your Joe average guy that just got his first big check from Bank of America or whatever, he or she is going to want a 911, a Carrera S, a little softer, a little bit more compliant for people that are not coming from the enthusiast pool, if that makes sense.
And CJ, I'll just make the observation, neither Harvey nor I mentioned boxer and track, right? Like you notice, like we just kind of glossed right over that.
You know, it's interesting that you say that because I remember when the Boxster popped, and for those that don't know, we're talking about a convertible sports car, two-seater, mid-engine. Interesting targeting, in my view, when I think about that, and who was the market? These were young dudes, maybe in their early 30s. I like the analogy of, hey, you know, now I'm getting a decent paycheck. The 911 might be slightly out of my reach. I'm going to snag this thing because chicks dig it, and I look cool. And here, I'll put the Ray-Bans on, you know. And of course, you know, I'm making jokes and being funny, or at least I'm trying. But in all seriousness, it wasn't coming out of the 80s and, you know, early 90s. The people who were buying the Boxsters were not the 911 traditional market, in my view. What do you think?
I lived that. I went through that. So my first car, I bought what I could afford. I found locally a 73 911T, had an S-Spec engine in it, blah, 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 loved it. I had that for about a year and a half, sold it, bought a super, super nice 83 911 SC Coupe. Loved it. It's actually still local to it. And then I think some of my options came into play, and I'm like, I want something new. So I bought a 1999 Boxster, and then traded in the following year. It's the only Porsche I've ever ordered specifically for me. I've never ordered one before, and I haven't ordered one since. But it was a Boxster, a 2000 Boxster S. Exactly the way I wanted it. Now, I was an enthusiast, but I wanted something new, but that's what I could afford at the time. It was another $20K uplift to get into the 911 at that point, and I just wasn't willing to spend that kind of money. Now, that being said, fast forward 1 year from the purchase date of the S, I bought a 993 coupe. So I went from 911, Boxster back to the 911, and I owned that car the longest that I've owned any Porsche. I had it in car, period. I owned it for 12 years, and it went from a pure stock street car to basically a club racer by the time I sold it. And as a matter of fact, I get emails from the guy that bought it from me. He lives in Ohio, and it's a pure track car, has a 4-liter engine in it, and I feel like a step parent now. So because I get information back on it, but
yeah, so you went like from air cooled to new Porsche.
Yeah,
experienced that for a year, and then went back like 5 years.
So and the thing is, there's a reckoning in my head from an enthusiast perspective. While I love the Boxster platform, I like the new car, it was just the 993 always spoke to me, and they finally got to the price point where it was like, I'm doing this. This is what I want. This is the vehicle for me. And that's just the way it worked out. I think every enthusiast goes through these different arcs in their enthusiast career.
Yep.
And sometimes you just come back to it's like, I thought this was better. It's not better to me. But I've also had more air cooled since I sold the 993. I sold that 10 years ago now. I've owned multiple water cooled, air cooled, water cooled since then. I'm on my second 997 now. I'm on my third Cayenne. So I'm kind of agnostic when it comes to the air cooled versus water cooled now. But the reality is the air cooled now are just so expensive. Even if I did want to go back, I'd have to sell 2 of my water cooled to get into 1 air cooled. So,
Fellas, listen, we could do this all day, and thank you for joining the Hot Seat Automotive Podcast. And I'm going to get you guys both back on because, number one, this is fun, but number two, you guys are just such characters with so much information. Let me put you both on the hot seat. Let's go rapid fire if we can. Is it going to get controversial? I don't know, but just a couple things. Real quick, Trent, what's next for Porsche? And maybe, there's a lot we could talk about, but there's EV, there's hybrid. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, a lot of people, and we've talked so much about just like traditional Porsche, ICE engine, internal combustion engines, right? Like Porsche has actually been in the EV space for a number of years now. Their Taycan, which I've had an opportunity to drive that car. Like I'm a fan of Porsche, right? I'm a fan of cars. I'm a fan of Porsche. I'm also a fan of torque. And like, if you know anything about EVs, they generate amazing amounts of torque, right? So if you have a chance to drive an EV, I know a lot of people that are totally dismissive of them, but like, just for giggles, go drive one sometime. Like that's a kind of a performance-oriented EV. They're pretty amazing. And Porsche has been in that space with Taycan for a number of years. So I think Porsche is definitely, in the EV game now. They're going to continue to be in the EV game. What much less known about Porsche that I think honestly is great news for car guys and specifically classic car guys. Porsche has actually created a process of creating carbon neutral traditional, gas, petrol, whatever you want to call it. So Porsche has a factory, the country in South America escapes me. It might be Argentina.
Yeah.
Where Porsche is actually using wind and solar power to create a gas that burns in internal combustion engines. So it's truly carbon neutral. And Porsche uses it to power some of their race teams this very day. It exists. And I believe the Goodwood Festival next year over in the UK is going to be solely powered on this fuel, right? So the future for Porsche, I think, as an organization is very bright. I suspect they'll continue with what I would say is a hybrid approach to their business. They're going to continue with internal combustion engines for foreseeable future, but they're going to continue to invest in the EV technology and platforms as well. And as I was saying, the good news to all of us that grew up in the internal combustion engine era, which is probably virtually everybody listening to this podcast, Porsche is coming to the rescue with their fuel, right? Their e-fuel. And that's actually a really, really cool thing.
Wow. Wow. Very cool stuff. I wasn't aware of that. Harvey, same question. What's your crystal ball say for Porsche?
So Trent said it, but he didn't say it. Porsche is super smart. Porsche is hedging their bet depending upon how this EV versus ICE ends up falling. All of us have seen over the course of the past few months that EV sales are dropping. I believe the folks that are the early adopters, the ones that are willing to put up with the quirks, the charging times, and stuff like that, I think that market has been saturated, and that's why you're seeing the drop. Ford's changing their Lightning production, all sorts of stuff. Tesla's still going to sell. Tesla's like the number one. That's going to continue going on. So most people like me, you, Trent, that are in that socioeconomic area, those if I'm going to go buy an EV right now, I'm going to go buy a Tesla. If push comes to shove, that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to buy GM. I'm not going to buy Ford. I'm going to buy it from the company that built these things from the ground up. And that's just the way it is. Porsche is playing a super, super smart game on this. So they're doing the electrification thing. They're doing the investment in there, but they also are keeping an eye on what's really going on in the market, which is there's a slowdown. So they don't want to get caught out like a lot of these other companies are right now. So to Trent's point on the synthetic fuel, a lot of people don't know this, but Formula One has made a commitment to moving to fully synthetic fuels by 2026, which is only a couple of years down the line. That's when they're doing a huge formula change. They're changing the engine. They're taking some stuff out. The car's gonna be a little bit smaller, blah, blah, blah. But the big technology thing, in my opinion, is synthetic fuels. So this is going to be kind of concept for synthetic fuels. Right now, synthetic fuels are viable, but they're super expensive. So, but once you scale, then the costs are going to come down. And Porsche, and I'm going to refer to something I said earlier, 75-80% of Porsches that ever built on the road. Guess what? 75% of those, you've got this many Taycans out there. That's it. You've got more EVs coming online. It remains to be seen how well that they're going to sell. So, but I think Porsche is in a super good position, regardless of which way the market ends up going. They are prepared. You've obviously going to have some tweaks in production at this plant versus this plant, as far as, oh, we need to do more EVs. Oh, we need to do more ICE cars. So that remains to be seen. Going to one of the other future things, and this is a hot topic in the enthusiast world, especially around 911s, is there going to be an electrified 911? I think it's inevitable that there probably will be one. And I know that they're looking at a hybrid model now. As a matter of fact, the 992, when it first came out, they engineered it. They had this space at the front of the transmission, which you could fit a hybrid unit in. They never used it, but it was there. So I think when Trent, what's the next iteration going to be? Because we're at 992 right now. We've already had a 993. What's going to be the next one?
I don't know, man. Like the Le Mans car, the 963. So they went from 964 to the 963. They went backwards.
Yeah, and they're jumping around. I don't know. It's going to be interesting. Maybe it'll be the 998 this time around, because they went from the 997. I thought it was going to be the 998, and they go back to anyway, whatever. So it's going to be interesting, but there's some articles floating around right now that Porsche has tested a V4 engine in the new 911 chassis, whatever it's going to be. I think that will die if that happens. I think the enthusiasts, most people, want the flat six. I think that's going to continue on for quite a while. I think I'm going to go to another manufacturer now. I've had this discussion with several friends of mine that aren't car people like us, but they're car people. The BMW i8.
Right.
So that vehicle crashed and burned. Reason being, you've got a car that looks like it's a supercar, which it was, but had a 3-cylinder internal combustion engine in it. Personally, I'm not going to spend that kind of money on a 3-cylinder engine. And they're talking about coming out with a new iteration that's going to have a 4-cylinder, but it's going to be a hybrid again. And I'm like, guys, take a look at the Acura NSX, the one that just they just stopped manufacturing. The reason it didn't sell, it was a hybrid. It's too complex. It was too heavy. People don't want that. If you look at the Lambo guys like yourself, CJ, do you really want a hybrid? I don't. While to Trent's point, you can get a lot of torque, blah, this and that. I don't want the weight. I don't want the complexity. You look at the resale market. You look at you take a Cayenne S, you compare it to a Cayenne hybrid. Guess which one's selling better and which one's bringing more money? It's the non-hybrid, because people know that there is complexity and there's repair costs and blah, and stuff that goes along. I like simple. If I'm going to do an EV, I'm going to do an EV. I don't want a hybrid. If I'm doing something with internal combustion engine, I don't want a hybrid. I'm going to go pure, whichever is less complexity.
Listen, great. There's so much just to unpack in what you both shared. But let me ask 2 final questions and let's wrap this up. I'm going to ask you both this question. So, an enthusiast looking to get into the Porsche game, maybe that up and comer who says, "Look, how can I get into the brand, get into it without breaking the bank, without going for a 6-figure car." Let's say they got 40, 50 grand. What's the buy right now? Trent, what do you think?
I mean, for 40 or 50 grand, like you could probably get yourself a decent driving air-cooled 911 for 40, 50 grand. It's not going to be a show car. It's going to have issues. It's going to probably, either you're going to need to wrench on it yourself or spend some money to have that car wrenched on. So there are some bargains out there popping up in that 50 grand in the air-cooled space, but you're not going to get a 964. You're not going to get a 993, those later iterations of the air-cooled. You're going to be probably in the mid-year cars that we started talking about in this conversation, right? I mean, honestly, for me, CJ, what I'm seeing, and I think there's, probably upside in value, is like we're seeing a car called the 994 start to pick up and actually become a popular car as an entry point to like the classic Porsche space, right? So water-cooled front engine car, but the car always has had great lines. And the enthusiast community is starting to realize now that, like you said, people are priced out of the air-cooled 911 space. Like the Singers, the RWBs have just raised the top of the market on these air-cooled 911s, right? The 994, I would say 5 years ago, was a woefully underappreciated platform. Now it's still just underappreciated, but like there are some beautiful 944s that are starting to pop up at car shows and on social media that are really great. And that's a car, depending on what condition, you can buy a 994 for under 10 grand, right? Now you get into the turbo iterations, you're going to exceed that number if they're, nice quality. But like, to me, if I'm starting out in the Porsche game and I know a 911's outside of my reach, I'm probably looking at the 994 platform because I think it's a really great looking car.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit. If you're someone that is just getting into the Porsche world, don't have any real experience with it, the air-cooled is going to be difficult because Trent knows, I know, the first thing that you need to find before you buy an air-cooled 911 is you need to find a mechanic that can work on it, because those guys are dwindling. We had a local guy. I'll mention his name because he's not in business anymore. Terry Sossaman. He owned a repair business called the 911 Shop. He's one of the first guys that I worked with when I bought my first 911, and he's tapped out. He's down at the beach fishing, and there's very few of these guys around. So that's one of the things that you must do is if you're going to get an earlier car, have someone that knows what they're doing working on it. You cannot take this to Jiffy Lube. You cannot take this to any repair shop. They will jack the car up and make your life miserable, and it will be very expensive. So my recommendation actually that price point that you said 40, 50K gives you a lot of options. Trent's not wrong. You can find some air-cooled cars in that price point, but they're probably going to need some work. My recommendation would be Cayman, Boxster. For that price point, you can get a Gen 1, really nice Gen 1 997.
Yeah.
That's where I would recommend that someone coming into this market start looking. Caymans, you can get a Gen 1 Cayman in the low 20s right now. Pretty decent car, probably have some miles on it. Boxster, and people need to figure out what they want. I mean, you've got transmission options. Are you a true enthusiast? Do you want a manual? Do you want I would recommend staying away from Tiptronics. So that would, from a Cayman perspective, that would put you into a .2, which would be 2009 and up. And you could probably get into a 981, which is the next generation Cayman for the price point that you're talking about. Pretty decent car. And you can get a PDK. PDKs are awesome, or you can get a manual. So there's lots of, for that price point, you've got a lot of different options out there. But just my recommendation, take your time, go drive the cars. Don't pick one and just buy it. Go drive them. Also, and Trent will back me up on this, make sure you get a pre-purchase inspection. So anyone, if you're buying from an individual or buying from a dealership and they balk on you getting a pre-purchase inspection done on said vehicle, walk away. That is not the vehicle for you. Will save you time, effort, and a lot of money. The 2 times out of the 18 Porsches that I bought to date, I've regretted not getting a PPI on those 2 cars.
Interesting. Wow. Great advice, guys. All right. The great phonetic debate. Tomato, tomato, potato, potato. Trent, is it Porsche or Porsche? Why? Go ahead.
Well, it's as pretentious as it may sound, it is Porsche, right? That is the name, right? It's real. Like, that's how the family pronounces the name, and that's the name of the company. So it is, it's a little bit of a thing, and it can be a barrier, and like you can see some eye rolls. And I personally, I think Harvey just said, I don't make it a point to correct people. Like, that's not my thing. But if you ask me, and if you notice, and you go through this podcast, Harvey and I both said Porsche the whole time, right? So it is Porsche, right? Like, if you call it Porsche, it's fine. Nobody's going to freak out, or all but the most pretentious won't freak out, right? But it is Porsche, right? So that's in my opinion, that's kind of where I come down on it. And I just, because that's the family name, that's what I try to pronounce.
Yeah. And to Trent's point, I am acquaintances, friends with Peter Porsche. I've met him several times, spent some time with him. The correct pronunciation is Porsche coming out of his mouth. So that's what I go with.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. And, credentialing and consider the source. Are they going to change my mind? Look, it's funny because whenever this comes up, you guys know I can't keep my mouth shut. But when this comes up, because I'll tend to say Porsche, because I'll be blunt, I do feel kind of pretentious when I say Porsche. Yes, yeah. Porsche. But now, having said that, what I'll say to people is, did you pay for my car? Did you cut the check? When you cut the check, I'll change my pronunciation. Anyway,
So CJ, I know you're a Lamborghini enthusiast, so I will share with you. And I think do you know Andreas Sterner?
Rings a bell, but not sure.
He's Austrian, former neighbor of mine. We go to the 24 hours at Daytona every year. Anyway, so his pronunciation for Lamborghini is Lamborghini. So I always go with that enunciation.
Oh gosh, we've got to have an episode where we just make fun of these things and laugh about them, because there are so many in the car community. Guys, we literally could do this all day and all night. And thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you're on. Hopefully this is just the beginning. We'll get you back on the hot seat soon. Trent, Cars and Cappuccino, what is it? Why does everybody need to go? I'm a card carrying member, and I can't wait for you to start up. How can people find you? Go ahead.
Yeah. So carsandcappuccino.com, that's the website. You can go check us out there. We're Charlotte, North Carolina based, European sports cars. We hold events which we call members meetings throughout the spring, summer, and early fall at a location called South Park Mall, which is a really, really nice mall, upscale mall in Charlotte, North Carolina. Our quote unquote members meetings are open to the public, so you can come out and just check out the cars. We have a lot of really cool European sports cars there. So we have Porsche, we have, Lancia, Alfa Romeo, Lamborghini, Aston Martins, Jaguars, bug-eyed Sprites. We have it all, minis, like it's all there, right? And so if you're into European sports cars, I mean, it's a really fun place to go. And it's really kind of low-key, family friendly. It's a little bit different than some of the other car meets that you might be familiar with. There's not a lot of what do I want to say, tomfoolery. Like we our members actually take Greedo code of conduct. Like, look, we want to be where we're at. We like our spot. So we encourage everybody to kind of like be considerate of their neighbors, because we're in kind of a urban spot in our meetups. So that's kind of what we do. So again, if you're a European sports car fan, you can go to the website. We'll be posting the 24 dates here pretty quickly, and just come check it out. It's a really good time. And I think it's a great way to spend a Sunday morning if you're into European sports cars.
Oh, heck yeah. And it's just a first class event, and I love it. I'm a fan. Thank you, Trent. Harvey, what about you? Any socials you want to promote? Are you still involved with the PCA? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm much to my wife's pleasure. I am just a member of PCA now. One of the things that I will encourage, though, because there's a lot of folks out there that have sports cars and they never really use them the way that they can be used. So I am an instructor. I've been an instructor with PCA since 2002, so it's been a minute. But PCA has a fantastic track program. It's called HPD, High Performance Drivers Education. We take people that have never been on the track before and teach them how to use their vehicles correctly. I'm also an instructor for a local track, Carolina Motorsports Park. They have an entity there called Turn One Motorsports, and I'm actually a paid instructor for them. It's a little less rigorous than PCA is. You can buy a track day, and you get the same thing. You get an instructor, you get classroom time like PCA does. So highly recommend that people try that out. If you've ever been curious as to what your vehicle can really do, most people will, squirt around a corner and tell, oh my gosh, I can drive so good. And it will make you a better driver. I will tell you that I have saved my own bacon probably 3 or 4 times during the past 15, 20 years, predicated on the skills that I acquired driving at the track.
Wow. And Harvey, how do your points are resonating. How do we contact Harvey?
I'm on Facebook, Harvey Yancey. You can find me out there. Feel free to reach out to me. If you're interested in the PCA stuff, you can just go up to locally. You can go to Carolinas Region PCA.com. It's carolinasregion.com, I believe, and nationally it's just pca.org, and you can drill down in there and get to whatever region that you're in. And it pretty much every region has track events and track instructors.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you, Harvey. Thank you, Trent. Fantastic stuff. For all of our listeners, be sure to like and subscribe. Check out Harvey. Check out Trent, Cars and Cappuccino. I know I learned a lot today. Guys, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to all those that celebrate, and just enjoy the season. Thank you so much, fellows. We'll see you on the road soon and see you in the community soon.
Thanks, CJ.
Thanks, CJ. Appreciate it.